Okay, so I noticed on the last quiz that some of you guys seem to have a little bit of trouble in regards to the orientation. So what I'm going to do is just a little tutorial to kind of reiterate what that Khan Academy video had discussed. Overall, I think it was pretty clear, but sometimes seeing it on an actual person, i.e. I'm going to use a dummy, might help a little bit. I'm going to do this and I'm going to have to go back and forth between the patient and the screen. However, with the screen, I won't have any images just because of I'm scanning a dummy and not a real person. So to start off, we have our, any transducer is going to be the same. It's going to have a notch on one side. So this is the notch that we have for this curvilinear transducer. You can see right here, there's another little nick on this edge. Whenever in doubt, if sometimes some of the probes have things on both sides, when in doubt, just look for the side that actually has more, and that's the notch side. So if we have the patient in a supine position like we do here, you are only going to, you're pretty much only going to be able to scan either from the anterior position or from the coronal position. So we'll start with the anterior position in sagittal and transverse, and then we will go through and move towards towards the coronal for a little bit of a further explanation. And you guys need to make sure that if you do not understand that you are reaching out to me versus me finding out on a quiz that you aren't really sure of what everything means as far as the orientation goes. So right now we're in a sagittal or long cut of the abdomen, and you can see here, do a little, so you can see here, my notch right now is right here pointing towards the patient's head. So that means, again, I'm in a sagittal position. Now, if we correlate with our screen per the Khan Academy video, and I'm going to turn it just so I can see a little bit of what I'm recording. So if we look at the screen here, we have our little indicator on this side. That's going to always correlate with whatever this notch is pointing to. So if that's the case, and we're going through and we have our notch pointing on the patient towards the patient's head, like you can see in our sagittal view, that means that this indicator will be pointing towards the sagittal superior portion of the patient's head as well. If that's the case, the exact opposite will be true on the other side of the screen. So that means that this is inferior and this is superior. And again, we know that this is superior because that's the portion that the notch is pointing to. Now, as far as this portion of the screen, the top and the bottom is concerned, it's where are we scanning to and where are we scanning from and to. So if we're starting off, we start off on the anterior portion of the patient. So we're scanning from the anterior portion towards the posterior. Imagine the probe like a flashlight. So if I were to put a flashlight down on this patient, we would see the beam. The beam would start here, and it would start to go through the patient and stop at a certain point, which is the same thing that happens with an ultrasound beam. So again, if we're scanning in a sagittal plane, the notch is going to be pointing towards the patient's head, which would correlate with the indicator, meaning superior, and then the exact opposite portion of the screen would be the inferior portion. And then the top and the bottom would be the to and the from, which in this case would be scanning from anterior to posterior. So again, if we were to correlate that on our screen, we have our, I'll put my probe down, our superior portion, because again, indicator and notch correlate with each other. And then on this portion of the screen, the right side of the screen, this would be inferior. And then to and from, which would be anterior to posterior. Now, if we are to go in a transverse plane or a crosscut, like we would see in a CT scan, you can see now that the notch is pointing towards me or the patient's right. So if we look at the screen, we know that, again, our notch correlates with the indicator on our screen. So if our notch is pointing towards the patient's right, that means that the indicator would be the patient's right-hand side, which would make this the exact opposite to be true as well, which would be the patient's left side. So again, if we look at our probe on the patient, you can see the notch is pointing towards me or the patient's right, and then the opposite side over on this side is pointing towards the patient's left. Whenever we discuss the actual orientation, it's always in regards to the patient, not ourselves. So yes, this notch is pointing towards me, but it's pointing towards the patient's right-hand side because of the way that the patient is laying. So again, on our screen, the notch will correlate with the indicator, which would be the patient's right, and then the exact opposite would be true on the left side of the screen, or I'm sorry, on the right side of the screen, which would be the patient's left. we are still scanning anterior to posterior because we have not moved our probe. So again, where are we going from? We start anterior, and then the sound beam will travel posteriorly in the patient. So again, in sagittal, which our notch would be pointing towards the patient's head, you would have superior on the left side of the screen, inferior on the right side of the screen, and then we're scanning from the patient's anterior, and the beam is traveling towards the patient's posterior. In transverse, the notch would be pointing towards the patient's right-hand side, which would make the exact opposite side of the screen, or our right, the patient's left-hand side, and we have not moved our probe, so we are still scanning from the patient's anterior to the patient's posterior. Because again, the sound beam travels into the body, and in this particular case, since we're going from the anterior portion, it can only travel posteriorly. Now, let's discuss coronal a little bit. So coronal is where we go through the patient's side, just as so. We'll start with sagittal. So again, if we look at the sagittal cut, where is my notch pointing? You can see it right here. So where is the notch pointing? Towards the patient's head again. So again, that would mean the notch and the indicator, both again correlating, are going to be pointing towards the patient's superior end. So if we look at the screen, again, our superior is still, or our indicator is still going to be superior in sagittal, and the opposite side, the right-hand side of the screen will still be inferior. So again, if we look, our notch is pointing towards the patient's head, which where our indicator would be, so that would be superior, and then the bottom portion, or this side over here, is pointing towards the patient's inferior half. So again, or inferior portion. So again, indicator and notch correlate, so superior, inferior. Now we have to think about what are we scanning from and where are we going to. We're no longer on the anterior approach, we are now coming coronally. So right now I am going from the patient's lateral right and scanning towards the medial portion of the patient. So again, when you're going through and when you start seeing pictures of these crosscuts, make sure you know, hey, this is the patient's right, this is the patient's lateral right. We're scanning towards the medial portion, but there's different approaches. So again, lateral right, and if we go on the other side, this would be lateral left towards medial. So again, the top of the screen and the bottom of the screen are always going to correlate to where are you scanning, where are you starting to scan from, and where is your beam going to. So again, we're superficially speaking, we are on the patient's lateral right side, and the beam is going to go through and travel into the body towards the medial portion of the patient. So again, if we're looking at our screen, again, we said we're in sagittal, so the indicator would be superior, and then the exact opposite side would be inferior, and since we are scanning laterally, it would be the patient's lateral right that we're scanning, starting to scan from, and then we are scanning to the medial aspect of the patient. So that is our two portion. So again, not just pointing towards the head, the exact opposite side is going to be pointing inferiorly. We are scanning from the lateral portion, the right lateral portion, and our beam is traveling medially into the patient. So again, if I put the probe down, I'm just going to use my hand. So again, we are scanning top of the screen from our lateral, right lateral, to the middle portion or medial aspect of the patient. So our beam is essentially going and starting through here, but it's traveling through the body, cutting the body, as if you were to pretty much take cut this patient right down the center here. It would just go directly into the body. It doesn't, I can't put my hand there, but it doesn't go up and travel around it like I'm demonstrating with my hand. But again, the beam travels from lateral to medial in the coronal aspect. So again, if we're in the sagittal aspect coronally, the notch will point towards the patient's head. So that would mean the left-hand side of the screen would be superior, and then the right-hand side of the screen would be inferior. The top of the screen would be lateral, and again, right lateral, because that's what side I'm scanning on, to the medial aspect of the patient. Now let's say we are in transverse, because we know that sagittal, nothing really changes as far as our notch still pointing towards the head. However, excuse me, if we go in transverse, where is our notch pointing now? Again, you can see the notch here, and I turn the probe to a transverse position. The notch is now pointing towards the table. And you can see, if we go under here, you can see that the notch is right there. So it's pointing towards the table or the patient's posterior aspect. So if that's the case, the notch and the indicator would both correlate posterior for this patient, which would make the exact opposite true on the other side or the right-hand side of our screen. So if we look at our screen, again, our indicator would be pointing towards the patient's back because so is our notch, so posterior. And then the opposite side or the right-hand side of the screen would be pointing anterior. So again, wherever your notch is pointing, you have to figure out where your notch is pointing first, and then the right-hand side of your screen is essentially going to be the exact opposite of that. So if your notch or your left-hand side of the screen is pointing posterior, then you can just assume that the other aspect of the probe or the right-hand side of the screen is going to be anterior. So if that's the case, all we did was turn the actual positioning of our probe. We're still scanning from the right lateral aspect to the medial aspect of this patient. So again, if we look at our screen, we are still scanning to and from the right lateral to the medial aspect of the patient. And again, our notch is now pointing towards the patient's posterior because we're in transverse coronal. And then the opposite side or the right-hand side of the screen will demonstrate the patient's anterior aspect. So if we were to go through and turn this patient, which I'm going to do, just to give you an example. And again, she's a little heavy. Again, if we're going through, and we'll do this same way. If we're going through and we're scanning through the back, my notch is again pointing towards the patient's head. Normally we would have her lying face down, but she's a little heavy for me to move with one hand. But you can see here my notch is pointing up towards the patient's head, but now my beam is going from the patient's posterior, and now I'm scanning from the posterior towards the anterior because we can't scan any more posteriorly. It won't go posterior to posterior, but my approach is through the patient's back or posterior, and I'm scanning forward, which would be the patient's anterior portion. And then again, depending on what side you're on, if you turn the notch is always going to face towards you. So if the patient is lying face down, now the notch will correlate with that patient's left-hand side, and then the opposite side would be true. So you really have to think about the patient's position and see where that notch is pointing on the position on the patient. And then again, think about where you're scanning from and scanning to. If we're sitting, I'm directly on the spine. We don't typically scan that on an adult. But if we look at where I'm scanning from and to, my notch is now currently pointing towards the patient's left-hand side, whereas if they were in the supine position, it would be pointing towards the right, but we have it towards the left-hand side. And this is why it's important to annotate your pictures, that you do have the patient in the prone position, because if not, everything might look a little bit backwards. So again, if we're going through posterior to anterior, our notch is pointing towards me, or in this particular case, the patient's left-hand side. And again, that would make the opposite side true on the screen. So that would mean our right side of our screen is now correlating to the patient's right. So again, roll Betty over. Again, if we're looking at our probe, we're going from the patient's right lateral aspect and scanning towards the medial portion. And then if we move to the opposite side, we are scanning from the patient's now left side, so it would be left lateral towards the medial aspect of the patient. Because again, if we're going, we really can't go any more lateral than this. So if you are going lateral, you're going to have to scan medially. And again, if we're scanning from the supine position and we're scanning from the anterior approach, the only way the sound beam can travel is posteriorly. So depending on where your notch is going to be what really changes the screen. The top and the bottom of the screen, are only going to change if you move your probe into a different area of scanning. So let's say, again, you're going and you're scanning from an anterior approach. It's going to be anterior to posterior, and then you would have to physically move your probe to the coronal position in order to change this. It's not going to change. The only thing that will change is where your notch or your indicator is. And again, this is assuming that you stay from the anterior approach. So again, if you're on the anterior aspect, it's always going to be anterior to posterior. This side or the left-hand side will change to superior or the patient's right. and then the right side of the screen will change to inferior or the patient's left. This is because our notch only points towards the patient's head or towards us. If you turn the notch and essentially make it point towards the patient's inferior aspect or towards their left, your screen will be backwards, which is something we don't want because, again, it's going to demonstrate that the normal anatomy is essentially backwards. So again, if we're going from an anterior approach, this is always going to be anterior to posterior, and then the left-hand side will either be superior or, again, the patient's right, and then the right-hand side of the screen will be inferior or the patient's left. So, and again, if we go through a coronal approach, we would have to physically move our probe to the coronal position on the patient. So again, if we went from anterior to posterior, the top of the screen would be anterior to posterior. We would have to physically move our probe to go from the coronal approach. And again, that's the only way the top and the bottom of the screen are going to change. And now we are going from lateral right to medial. So again, from lateral right to medial. And that will not change unless, again, we move our probe to a different spot on the patient. The only thing that will change in the coronal approach is that your indicator side, or again, the left-hand side of the screen, will either be superior or posterior. Because again, if we take our notch and we go into transverse, we're going to be pointing towards the patient's back, which would make this portion of the screen either, again, inferior or anterior. It just depends on which position you're in. So again, coronally, we would go from the lateral aspect, depending on what side. So again, you're going to want to label right lateral or left lateral towards the medial aspect. And then again, if we are in sagittal, it would always be superior and inferior. Or if we are in transverse, it will be posterior, because that's the direction our notch will be pointing, and anterior. So I'm hoping this clears up a little bit, clarifies some things. If you do have questions, by all means, reach out. But I wanted to show you, we can do some drawings if this doesn't work. I do believe if you haven't gotten into the lab yet, hands-on is really the best way to make this set in. But you have to realize that there's only a couple different ways that you can go through, essentially, and do. You can't have superior and right and left in the same screen. And again, this is why I know this kind of confused people. But again, if we're in a sagittal cut, you can see the superior and you can see the inferior, because again, our notch is pointing superior and the exact opposite side is pointing inferior. But you would have to physically sweep right or left to see right and left. So you'd have to physically sweep right and left in the sagittal aspect in order to see the right and left. Now, with the transverse cut, again, you can see that our notch is pointing towards the patient's right. You can see right, and then you can see left on the opposite side, but you would have to physically move superior or inferior in order to see structures outside of your normal, of the area you're particularly scanning. So again, if you're in transverse, you cannot see superior or inferior unless you physically move. If you are in sagittal, you cannot see right or left unless you physically move the probe. And again, if you have any questions, please, by all means, don't hesitate to contact me. We can always set up a live tutor session, or again, we can come in. I'm in almost every day of the week. You can always just do a little brief meet with me, and we can, do some distancing, or maybe we can explain this a little further. If this doesn't help, hopefully it does.